May 12th, 1943, near Zagouan, Tunisia. The desert wind howled across the jagged ridges as the last remnants of the German Afrika Korps staggered down the road under white flags. Their boots were caked with sand and oil, their tunics torn and faded from months of retreat. Among them was Gefreiter Karl Meier, 22 years old, once a mechanic from Stuttgart. He clutched his canteen empty for 2 days and squinted at the line of American GMC trucks rolling toward them, dust spiraling behind their tires. A U.S. sergeant jumped down, his Thompson submachine gun slung casually at his side. "All right, boys, line up, you're done here." His tone was firm but not cruel. Meier blinked. No shouting, no beating, just efficiency. He had expected anger after all. They had fought these men in the desert for months. But instead of vengeance, he saw soldiers handing out Lucky Strike cigarettes and tin cups of water. As the column of prisoners marched toward the port of Bizerte, Meier caught sight of something that didn't fit the image painted by Nazi propaganda: American soldiers laughing, joking, and offering chocolate to the children watching from the roadside. They were human, ordinary, not the monstrous caricatures he'd seen in newsreels. By the next morning, Karl and thousands of others were packed aboard the Liberty ship SS Samuel Chase, bound not for Europe, but for America itself. Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. "They're taking us to the United States." For many, the idea was terrifying. For Meier, it was surreal. He stared at the receding African coast, wondering what waited across the ocean. Would it be punishment? Labor camps? Torture? The officers whispered. "They'll work us like slaves." But deep down, no one truly knew. As the engines roared to life and the convoy began its slow journey west, Meier could only imagine what the new world might hold and whether he'd ever see Germany again. June 3rd, 1943, mid-Atlantic, aboard the SS Samuel Chase. The Liberty ship groaned as it rode the grey swells of the ocean. The air was thick with diesel fumes and salt. In the cramped hold, hundreds of German prisoners huddled in rows on wooden bunks. Some whispered prayers, others stared at the steel walls, counting the hours. The rhythmic thump of the engines was the only constant sound, a mechanical heartbeat that lulled them between fear and exhaustion. Karl Meier lay awake, listening to the distant crash of waves. Every few hours, the guards, young Americans barely older than he, was opened the hatch to bring food. White bread, canned meat, and strong black coffee. It wasn't much, but it wasn't cruelty either. They weren't beaten, they weren't starved. Even when one prisoner collapsed from seasickness, the Americans carried him to the deck for fresh air. At dusk, Karl was allowed up top. The horizon burned orange. He gripped the railing, gazing at the endless expanse. Behind him, a group of GIs were playing cards, laughing over a portable radio that crackled with a jazz tune, Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing. The rhythm drifted across the deck, surreal and strange. "Can you believe this?" murmured Feldwebel Dietrich Hahn, standing beside him. "The Americans, they listen to music during war." Karl smiled faintly. "They fight and dance at the same time." Hahn shook his head. "They don't understand discipline. It's all too casual." But as the sun dipped below the waves, Meier wasn't so sure. There was something different about these men, something freer. No propaganda lecture, no political officer watching their words. Just soldiers being human. After 2 weeks, the convoy finally sighted land, a dark outline against the misty dawn. The Statue of Liberty gleamed faintly in the distance, its torch like a ghost in the fog. The prisoners crowded the rail, silent. America. They had been told it was a nation of greed and chaos, a land of decay. But now, as they entered New York Harbor, the skyline rose like a wall of steel and glass, modern, alive, magnificent. As the Liberty ship eased into port, the U.S. guards gathered the POWs on deck. "Welcome to the States," one of them said. "Don't try anything stupid, and you'll live better than most of Europe right now." The prisoners exchanged wary glances. What awaited them beyond those towers? None could imagine that within days they would see things that defied every image Nazi Germany had burned into their minds. July 4th, 1943, Camp Swift, Texas. The air shimmered with heat as the train hissed to a stop. Karl Meier pressed his face to the window and saw endless plains stretching under a blazing Sunday. Barbed wire fences glittered in the light, and beyond them stood neat rows of wooden barracks, not the brutal concrete prisons they'd imagined, but something closer to an orderly village. American MPs guided them out calm, businesslike, rifles slung but never raised. "Keep moving, fellas," one said, chewing gum. "Showers first, chow later." Inside the camp, Meier was stunned by the sight. Wide gravel paths, clean latrines, even flower beds near the gate. The smell of freshly baked bread drifted through the air. One prisoner muttered in disbelief. "They treat us better than our own army." Each man received a uniform stenciled PW in bold black letters, along with a bar of soap, a towel, and a metal cup. The barracks had bunk beds with clean sheets, windows that opened, and even fans. A far cry from the Eastern Front nightmares they'd once lived through. That evening, after roll call, the camp kitchen served meat stew, potatoes, and bread portions so large that even the Americans joked about feeding the enemy too well. Meier couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten this much. He sat at a long table with other POWs, spoon in hand, half expecting a trick. "Why?" someone asked in hushed German. "Why would they feed us like this?" An older man replied quietly, "Because they can." Later that night, as the sun sank behind the Texan hills, the prisoners were startled again this time by the sound of music. Outside the mess hall, an American soldier set up a record player. From its tinny speaker poured a smooth voice, "I've Got a Gal in Kalamazoo" by Glenn Miller. Laughter rippled through the guards. One handed a bottle of Coca-Cola to another, the glass sweating in the evening heat. Karl stared, transfixed. "Coca-Cola," he whispered. He'd seen it in propaganda leaflets, portrayed as a symbol of American decadence. Now it sat in the guard's hand, simple, cold, ordinary. "Want a sip?" the guard asked suddenly, noticing his stare. Karl hesitated, then nodded. The guard smiled and handed him the bottle through the wire. The first taste was sharp, sweet, and alive, a flavor of another world. For a moment, the war felt far away. He looked around. The guards weren't cruel. The food was good. The air was free. Everything he'd been told about America was beginning to unravel. July 18th, 1943, Camp Swift, Texas. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, but the life inside the camp felt strangely normal. Karl Meier woke each morning to the distant hum of trucks on the highway and the smell of coffee wafting from the American mess hall. The guards moved easily among the prisoners, disciplined, yes, but not hostile. Work details were organized: farm labor, carpentry, kitchen duty. But after hours, the POWs could wander within the wire, read, play soccer, or simply sit under the shade of the mesquite trees. Karl often joined the soccer matches. The Americans watched from outside the fence, laughing and cheering as if it were a college game. Then came the day that changed everything, the day of the ice cream wagon. It was a Sunday afternoon, unbearably hot. A faint tune floated through the camp, a jingle of bells. Moments later, an ice cream truck rolled up to the gate, the silver letters on its side gleaming, "Dairy Queen." The prisoners gathered in disbelief. "Is that for us?" one whispered. The camp commandant, Captain Harold Peterson, a stocky man with a southern drawl, waved the truck in. "Every man gets one scoop," he announced with a grin. "You've earned it." Not. As the line moved forward, Karl watched Americans and Germans alike laughing under the sun, each holding a paper cup of vanilla ice cream. When it was his turn, he hesitated, almost embarrassed. He hadn't tasted anything like this since before the war. The first bite melted instantly on his tongue, cold, sweet, perfect. Around him, men who had faced tanks and bombers now smiled like children. One guard leaned on the fence, chuckling. Not what Goebbels told you, huh? Karl looked up, unsure how to answer. The guard added softly, You're in America now. We don't hate you, just what you fought for. That night, as the air cooled, the camp projector flickered to life. A makeshift screen stretched between two barracks, and a crowd of POWs gathered for their first movie night. The film, It Happened One Night, starring Clark Gable. Laughter erupted as the film played, echoing under the Texas stars. Even those who barely understood English felt the warmth, the simplicity of it. Karl leaned back on the bench, eyes glistening in the silver light of the screen. In that moment, he realized the truth. America wasn't the land of corruption he'd been warned about, it was the land of abundance and mercy. The war was still raging oceans away, but here inside the wire, something was changing quietly inside the hearts of men who had once sworn to destroy this country. August 2nd, 1943, Camp Swift, Texas. The days had begun to blend into one another, a rhythm of work, meals, and small moments of calm that felt almost impossible for men once called the enemy. Karl Meier now worked in the camp's carpentry shed, repairing furniture for nearby U.S. Army offices. The air smelled of pine and sawdust. American guards passed by casually, humming tunes from radios tuned to NBC News. It was during one of those slow afternoons that the truth hit hardest. Private Johnson, a friendly guard from Ohio, entered the workshop carrying a folded newspaper. "You fellas might want to see this," he said, placing it on the table. The headline read, Allied forces land in Sicily. The Germans froze. Meier stared at the black letters, tracing them with his calloused fingers. He whispered, "They're in Italy already?" Johnson nodded. "Yup. War's moving fast." He handed Meier the rest of the paper. Inside were photos of American soldiers smiling with Italian children, Allied tanks rolling through dusty villages, and an article describing how U.S. medical units were treating both Allied and Axis wounded alike. "This can't be real," muttered one prisoner. "Our papers said America was collapsing, riots, famine." Johnson shrugged. "Guess they lied to both of us, huh?" That night, Karl lay awake on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The words of Goebbels' broadcasts echoed in his memory. The Americans are degenerate, lazy, unfit for real war. Yet the men who guarded him were strong, disciplined, and strangely kind. The food, the order, the sheer prosperity of this place, all of it clashed with everything he had believed. Weeks later, the camp received a small shipment of German-language books and newspapers, carefully censored but still informative. Among them was a translated copy of Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer. The Americans allowed POWs to borrow and discuss them. Karl began reading in the evenings, discovering humor and freedom in words that didn't exist in Nazi literature. One night, his barracks leader, Oberfeldwebel Kraus, confronted him. "Stop reading that American trash." Kraus snapped. "It's meant to soften you." Karl looked up quietly. "Maybe, but it's also making me think." Kraus glared at him, then turned away, but others in the room nodded slowly. Something was shifting not just in Karl, but in dozens of men across the camp. For the first time, they began to wonder if the war they'd fought had been built on lies. Days later, the camp held a small Sunday service, led by a captured chaplain from Bavaria. As the men sang softly, a breeze rustled the American flag above the camp gate. Karl watched it flutter and thought, perhaps freedom doesn't belong to one nation after all. Beyond the wire, the faint sound of a Coca-Cola truck jingle drifted on the wind. That familiar clinking tune that once symbolized decadence now sounded like peace. September 10th, 1943, Camp Swift, Texas. The summer heat began to fade, replaced by the dry, golden light of early autumn. The cotton fields outside the camp were ready for harvest, and German POWs were sent in work crews to assist local farmers under U.S. supervision. For the first time, Karl Meier saw rural America up close: wooden barns, windmills creaking in the distance, families waving as the trucks passed by. The civilians didn't spit or jeer. Some even smiled. At midday, an elderly farmer named Mr. Thompson approached with a cooler of drinks. He offered the Germans bottles of Coca-Cola, their glass sides fogged with condensation. Karl hesitated. "You trust us?" he asked in broken English. Thompson chuckled. "Son, you're just men work in the field. War's somewhere else." They drank under the shade of a pecan tree, sharing bread and boiled eggs from the farmer's wife. Meier listened as the Americans talked about their sons fighting in Europe not with hatred, but with weary hope. "Bring them home," Thompson said quietly, staring toward the horizon. Back at the camp, the atmosphere was changing too. English lessons were being offered by volunteer guards and Red Cross workers. Some prisoners learned carpentry, mechanics, or even music. The barracks echoed with harmonicas and laughter, a strange symphony of former enemies discovering life beyond ideology. One evening, the camp organized a baseball game. Americans versus Germans. The POWs, curious, tried to learn the rules, confusing bases for goals and arguing over strikes. By the end, both sides were laughing so hard that no one cared who won. "Baseball," Karl wrote in his journal, "is war without hatred." That same night, an American chaplain visited the camp to deliver a sermon. He spoke gently. "Men, you are prisoners, yes, but not slaves. America fights to free, not to enslave. Remember that." His words lingered in Karl's mind long after the service. He began to see the guards not as captors, but as mirrors, reflections of what Germany could have been if the war had never consumed it. The propaganda walls inside him were cracking. He thought of his home, his mother's small bakery in Stuttgart, the street where the swastika flags had once hung, the neighbors who vanished when they asked too many questions. One night, lying awake, Karl whispered to himself, "They said America was our enemy. But here I found my humanity again." The war was still raging in Europe. But inside the Texas wire, another quiet revolution was taking place in the minds of men learning that compassion could conquer indoctrination. As the loudspeakers played Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, the camp lights flickered against the night sky. Somewhere beyond the wire, a dog barked, and a Coca-Cola bottle cap clicked open, a small sound of normal life in a world gone mad. October 21st, 1943, Camp Swift, Texas. The mornings had grown cooler. A thin mist hung over the camp fences as prisoners lined up for mail call. For many, it was the most anticipated moment of the week, a fragile connection to the world they had left behind. Karl Meier's name was called. "Mail from Germany!" the guard shouted, handing him a creased envelope stamped with censor markings. He tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter from his mother in Stuttgart, short, cautious, but filled with love. She wrote of air raids, ration lines, and the silence that had fallen over their street. "We pray every day for this war to end," she wrote. "They say America is cruel, but if you are safe, then perhaps not everything we are told is true." Karl read those words again and again until the ink blurred. He realized his mother was beginning to doubt too, just as he had. The camp censors allowed prisoners to write back, within limits. That night, under the dim bulb of the barracks, Karl began his reply. "Mother," he wrote, "they treat us fairly here. We have food, work, and even laughter. I have tasted ice cream and Coca-Cola. It sounds foolish, but these small things make me think maybe our enemies are not monsters. Maybe they are just men like us." Oh, weeks later, those letters, hundreds of them, would ripple across Germany, quietly undermining Nazi propaganda. Some were intercepted, some reached families who whispered the truth in secret. The Americans are not what they told us they were. In Camp Swift, life continued. New prisoners arrived from Italy and France, battle-worn, angry, skeptical. But they too were disarmed, not by force, but by kindness. Within weeks, they were playing soccer, attending English classes, and writing letters home about the land of abundance. One cold evening, a Red Cross truck arrived with supplies and news, a gramophone, books, even Christmas decorations for the coming winter. The Americans said it was part of the Geneva Convention. Every prisoner had the right to humane treatment. But to Karl and the others, it felt like a miracle. When December came, the camp chapel glowed with candlelight. POWs sang Still Nacht, while the American guards stood quietly outside, listening. Snowflakes began to drift over the fences, rare in Texas. For a moment, no one thought of home or ideology. They simply sang. Afterward, one of the guards approached Karl with 2 tin mugs of hot cocoa. "Merry Christmas, Fritz," he said with a grin. Karl laughed softly. "You shouldn't call me that." The guard shrugged. "Then what should I call you?" "Karl," he answered. "Just Karl." "But—" The man extended his hand. "Then Merry Christmas, Karl." It was the first time Karl had shaken hands with an American. That night, as the camp lights dimmed, he wrote one more line in his journal. "They took our weapons and gave us back our souls." February 10th, 1944, Camp Swift, Texas. Winter in central Texas was mild, but the prisoners could still feel the chill in the air each morning. Frost glazed the grass, and the sky glowed pale blue over the rows of wooden barracks. The war in Europe was now entering its bloodiest year, but within the fences of Camp Swift, a quiet transformation was unfolding, one that no gun could force and no propaganda could contain. The Americans had begun an unusual program, the Intellectual Diversion Project. It aimed to re-educate German POWs, teaching democracy, ethics, and history through discussion and literature. Some officers scoffed, but others, like Karl Meier, were drawn to it like moths to light. Each evening, small groups gathered in the mess hall, now turned into a makeshift classroom. There were chalkboards, English dictionaries, and even a few German-translated copies of the U.S. Constitution. Lieutenant Henry Ross, a university professor in civilian life, stood at the front. "You were told freedom means chaos," he said one night, his voice calm. "But freedom is order chosen, not imposed." Karl listened, fascinated. The more he learned, the more he realized how much had been stolen from him, not land or food, but truth. He began teaching others how to read English, sharing what he understood. They spoke about democracy, dignity, and human worth, words that once sounded like weakness in Nazi Germany, now burning like revelation. Still, not everyone changed easily. Oberfeldwebel Kraus, the same hardliner who had once chastised Karl for reading American books, stood one night outside the barracks and hissed, "You've forgotten who you are. You're letting them brainwash you." Karl met his stare. "No, Kraus. For the first time, I'm thinking for myself." A month later, Kraus stopped attending the secret Nazi meetings held in the laundry shed. He too began to ask questions. Outside the camp, American townsfolk noticed the POWs' discipline and respect. Local newspapers printed stories of German prisoners helping rebuild barns after storms, of young men who learned to say thank you and God bless in English. One afternoon, Karl helped repair a school roof in the nearby town of Elgin. When the work was done, a group of children surrounded him. A girl, maybe 10 years old, handed him a small paper bag. Inside were 2 sugar cookies and a note that read, "For the man who helped Daddy." Karl swallowed hard. "Danke," he whispered. That night, back at camp, he wrote in his journal, "I came here as a soldier. I am leaving as a man. They have defeated us not by fear but by kindness. The ice cream, the Coca-Cola, the laughter, these were more than luxuries. They were messages. Proof that strength did not have to come from cruelty, and that victory could be measured not in bodies, but in hearts changed." Beyond the fences, the war still thundered Monte Cassino, Normandy, Berlin's ruin yet to come. But inside Camp Swift, men who once wore the eagle and swastika were discovering the meaning of humanity again. The camp's orchestra played Glenn Miller every weekend now. Under the stars, with music echoing across the Texas plains, the prisoners and guards sometimes stood side by side, not as enemies but as men who, for a moment, had stepped out of history's madness. May 8th, 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. A sharp crackle of radio static filled the mess hall. The POWs paused, their tools and books momentarily forgotten. The American guards gathered near the loudspeaker as a voice announced, solemn yet triumphant, "Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over." For a long moment, silence hung over the room. Then a few cheers rose from the guards outside, mixed with the faint strains of "God Bless America" drifting from a radio. But inside the barracks, the Germans sat motionless, stunned, hollow. Karl Meier lowered his head. He thought of his mother, of Stuttgart's narrow streets now scarred by bombs. He imagined the ruins of cities he once loved, the thousands of lives shattered by the ideals they'd been taught to worship. Around him, some men wept quietly. Others stared blankly, unable to process that it was truly over. Captain Peterson, the camp commandant, entered the hall. He removed his cap. "Men," he said softly, "the war has ended. You are now prisoners of peace." He let the words sink in, then added, "You'll be going home soon, but not the same men who came here, I think." In the following weeks, the mood in the camp shifted again. Where there had once been resentment, now there was reflection. The American guards began dismantling the small comforts, the movie projector, the baseball field, even the old Coca-Cola machine by the mess hall door. Each evening, Karl walked along the fence line, gazing at the sunset. The Texas sky stretched endlessly orange, fading into violet, a sight he'd grown to love. He realized he would miss this place, this unlikely island of mercy in a sea of war. One day, Lieutenant Ross found him sitting by the fence, notebook in hand. "Writing again, Karl?" Ross asked. Karl nodded. "Yes. About what happened here. About what I learned." Ross smiled. "Good. People will need to hear it, especially back home." When the transport orders finally came, the prisoners packed their few belongings. They traded addresses with guards, shook hands, even hugged. One GI slipped Karl a small gift, a glass Coca-Cola bottle, empty but clean and gleaming. "A souvenir," the guard said. "Proof you made it." As the trucks rumbled away from Camp Swift, Karl turned for one last look. The flag above the gate fluttered in the morning wind. He whispered, "So this is what freedom really looks like." In his pocket, the empty bottle clinked softly, a fragile relic of his captivity, and of the revelation that had changed him forever. October 1946, Stuttgart, Germany. Rain tapped softly on the shattered rooftops. The once proud city lay in ruins, stone skeletons where homes had stood, tram lines twisted like wire, posters of the fallen Reich peeling from cracked walls. Amid the rubble, Karl Meier walked slowly, carrying a small canvas duffel marked PW. He was home, yet everything felt foreign. His mother's bakery was gone, bombed in the raids of 45. She now lived in a basement with a single candle for light. When she saw him, she cried not from joy alone, but disbelief. "You're alive! After all this time?" Karl smiled faintly and handed her a small parcel, the empty Coca-Cola bottle, wrapped in cloth. "A piece of America," he said softly. "From the camp." She turned it in her hands, confused. "They gave you this?" "They gave me much more than that," Karl replied. "They gave me my mind back." "Oh." As he settled into civilian life, Karl began sharing stories of the American camps of ice cream on Sundays, movie nights under the stars, and guards who shook hands instead of striking. People didn't believe him at first. Lies, some said, propaganda in reverse. But others listened. Farmers, students, even returning soldiers began to ask questions, and for the first time, truth had a chance to breathe. Months passed. The Allied authorities encouraged former POWs like Karl to help rebuild Germany's spirit, to show that humanity could survive even defeat. Karl found work as a carpenter, repairing doors for new schools. Sometimes, when children played outside, he would hear them humming American tunes they'd picked up from the occupation radio. Glenn Miller, Andrew's Sisters, The Rhythm of Freedom. One afternoon, a Red Cross official visited and asked to record his testimony. Sitting in a cold municipal office, Karl recounted what he had seen, the kindness, the contradictions, the simple mercy of a scoop of ice cream handed to a starving soldier. When the interviewer asked, "What surprised you the most?" Karl answered without hesitation. How they could win a war without hatred. In time, he became part of a small but growing movement of former POWs who spoke publicly about their experiences. They told of the lessons learned in America's prison camps, that democracy was not chaos, that compassion could conquer ideology, that dignity could exist even behind barbed wire. Years later, when Germany began to rebuild itself into a democracy, those same men, once enemies, became its foundation stones. Teachers, engineers, craftsmen, voices of conscience who refused to let cruelty rise again. Karl often kept that empty Coca-Cola bottle on his desk, a reminder of a day in Texas when an American guard had handed him a cold drink and, unknowingly, a new beginning. Every Christmas thereafter, he poured water into it and placed a single white flower inside, not as tribute to a nation, but to an idea, that even in war, decency can survive. And so, the story of the POWs who expected punishment but found humanity instead became a quiet legend, a testament to what America chose to be when the world was burning. They took our weapons, Karl would tell his children, but they gave us something far greater hope.